Have you ever found yourself frustrated, even drained, by someone who seems impossible to understand or get along with? Maybe it's a colleague who pushes your buttons, a family member whose words cut deep, or a stranger whose actions leave you shaking your head. We all encounter difficult people, those whose presence stirs discomfort, anger, or confusion within us. And yet, here lies a profound paradox. One of the greatest spiritual challenges and gifts is to cultivate compassion for these very people. Compassion, as taught in Buddhism, is far from a vague, feel-good notion. It is a radical practice, demanding courage and insight. It asks us to step beyond the surface of our pain and see the hidden suffering behind difficult behavior. To truly open our hearts to those who test us takes a special kind of bravery, a willingness to face discomfort without turning away. This journey isn't easy. When confronted by harsh words or unkind acts, our instinct often leads us to shut down, push back, or close off. But the ancient wisdom of the Buddha invites us to pause, reflect, and respond with something much deeper. Compassion isn't just about feeling sorry for someone else. It's an active, living intention, the desire to relieve suffering, including the suffering that causes difficult behavior in others. Imagine how transformative it could be if instead of recoiling from those who challenge us, we leaned in with a compassionate heart. What if we could unlock a new kind of freedom, where frustration gives way to understanding, and conflict transforms into connection? This isn't just spiritual idealism. Modern psychology and neuroscience reveal that practicing compassion reshapes our brains, reduces stress, and improves relationships. It fosters resilience, the ability to stay calm and clear amidst life storms. And at the heart of Buddhism, compassion is inseparable from wisdom. It's about seeing clearly, with eyes unclouded by judgment or resentment. Over the course of this exploration, we will dive into what it really means to cultivate compassion for those who seem the hardest to love. We'll unravel the Buddhist teachings that ground this practice and reveal practical tools to soften the grip of anger and fear. Together, we'll learn how to cultivate a mind that is both tender and strong, how to hold space for pain without being overwhelmed, and how to turn difficult encounters into opportunities for profound growth. Whether you've struggled with someone in your life who feels impossible to bear, or you simply want to deepen your understanding of compassion's transformative power, this journey will offer insights and guidance. You'll discover how compassion can be a path to healing, not only for others but for yourself. So let's begin with an open heart, ready to explore the mystery and power of compassion in the face of difficulty. This path may challenge us, but it holds the promise of a profound shift from conflict to connection, from judgment to understanding, from separation to unity. Let's step forward together. To truly understand how to cultivate compassion for difficult people, we must first journey into the heart of Buddhist wisdom. Compassion, or K-A-R-U letter 1E47 macron in the ancient Pali language, is not simply a soft feeling or fleeting emotion. It is a profound and active quality of mind that lies at the very core of the Buddha's teachings. At its essence, compassion is the sincere wish to relieve the suffering of others. But more than that, it's a deep recognition of the universal experience of pain and struggle that connects all living beings. The Buddha taught that all beings, whether friend or foe, share the same basic desire: to be free from suffering and to find true happiness. This realization forms the foundation of compassion. When we see beyond surface actions, the anger, the harsh words, the difficult behaviors, and perceive the hidden wounds beneath, our hearts naturally soften. We come to understand that difficult people are not enemies to be fought or avoided, but fellow travelers on the path of life, each carrying their own burdens and fears. But compassion in Buddhism is inseparable from wisdom or prajna. Without wisdom, compassion risks becoming sentimental or naive, an empty pity that doesn't truly address the roots of suffering. Wisdom helps us see clearly, to understand the causes and conditions that give rise to pain, and to respond skillfully. This is why Buddhist practice often emphasizes the balance of these two qualities, compassion and wisdom, heart and mind working in harmony. Compassion motivates us to act kindly and patiently, while wisdom guides our actions so that they are effective and grounded in reality. One of the Buddha's most beautiful teachings on compassion is the metta bhavana, the practice of loving-kindness meditation. This practice involves cultivating genuine goodwill and warmth toward all beings, starting with oneself, then extending outward to friends, strangers, and even those we find difficult. Over time, this meditation nurtures an open-hearted attitude that can transform our inner landscape. Another key teaching is the concept of dependent origination, the insight that all phenomena arise in dependence on causes and conditions. This understanding helps dissolve the illusion of fixed, separate selves, revealing the interconnectedness of all beings. Recognizing this interconnectedness naturally fuels compassion, because the suffering of one is the suffering of all. Importantly, the Buddha did not ask his followers to develop compassion as a mere ideal. He offered practical methods and daily exercises to train the mind. Compassion is a skill that grows with patience, mindfulness, and persistent effort. And here lies a hopeful truth. Even in the face of the most difficult people, compassion can arise and flourish within us. It may not happen overnight, but each small moment of understanding and kindness plants a seed for profound transformation. As we move forward, we will explore how this foundation of compassion and wisdom can guide us in relating to those who challenge us most. We'll learn how to gently uncover the suffering beneath difficult behavior and how to respond in ways that heal rather than harm. Because when compassion is rooted in wisdom, it becomes a powerful force, one that softens hearts, bridges divides, and awakens us to a deeper truth about ourselves and others. With this understanding as our guide, the path of compassion begins to unfold not as a burden, but as a gift that enriches our lives and the world around us. When we encounter difficult people, it's easy, almost automatic, to label them toxic, selfish, arrogant, manipulative. And in doing so, we unknowingly create a barrier, a wall between us and them. But what if we paused for a moment and looked a little deeper? What if, instead of judging by their behavior, we considered the suffering that might be hiding behind their actions? This is one of the most profound insights in Buddhist teaching, that every being who causes harm, whether to others or to themselves, is acting from a place of inner suffering. It may not always be visible, it may not always excuse the behavior, but it is always there. The Buddha taught that suffering, or dukkha, is an unavoidable part of existence. No one escapes it. Some people carry their suffering like a silent shadow, quietly, invisibly. Others express it through anger, fear, or control. Difficult people are often those whose inner pain has not found a healthy outlet. It leaks out in ways that are disruptive, sometimes even destructive. Think of a person who constantly criticizes others. On the surface, it's easy to feel irritated, even defensive. But if we look closely, we might see a person riddled with self-doubt, trying to mask their insecurity by focusing attention elsewhere. Or consider someone who lashes out in anger. Behind that fury, there's often fear, hurt, or a deep sense of powerlessness. In Buddhism, this understanding is not an invitation to be naive or to tolerate harm blindly. It's a call to see clearly, to recognize that difficult behavior is almost always a symptom of deeper wounds. And when we truly see that, our hearts begin to soften, not out of weakness but out of wisdom. The ancient masters often likened people to sick patients in a hospital. Some wounds are obvious, others are hidden beneath the surface. Some people scream in pain, others grow silent. The healer doesn't hate the patient for their symptoms. Instead, they seek to treat the root cause. In the same way, when we view difficult people through the lens of suffering, we move beyond reactive emotions and toward compassionate understanding. This isn't easy. Our egos resist it. There's a part of us that clings to resentment, that wants to stay angry because it feels safer, even justified. But the Buddha invites us to reflect. Holding on to anger is like grasping a hot coal with the intent of throwing it at someone else. You are the one who gets burned. The practice, then, is to see the suffering behind the mask, to look beyond the sharp words, the cold silence, the aggressive tone, and ask ourselves, what pain might this person be carrying? What unmet needs are fueling this behavior? This doesn't mean we have to condone harmful actions or pretend that pain doesn't exist, but it does mean we approach with a different heart, one that holds space for both truth and tenderness. It's a shift from "how dare they" to "I wonder what burden they're carrying." And this shift changes everything. It moves us out of the cycle of blame and retaliation and into a space of healing. Because in recognizing the suffering in others, we also acknowledge our own. We remember that we too have been difficult at times. We too have acted out of pain. And in that shared humanity, a bridge is built. In this chapter of our journey, we plant the seeds of a deeper, quieter compassion, one that doesn't seek to fix or rescue, but simply to see, to witness the hidden battles others are fighting, and to respond, not with more hurt, but with wisdom and care. And from this foundation, we'll soon explore how to manage our own reactions in these moments, how to stay grounded when someone else's suffering spills into our space, because compassion for others must begin with compassion for ourselves. But for now, let this truth settle in your heart. Every difficult person you encounter is carrying something you cannot see, and behind every harsh word, there is a wound that longs to be healed. As we begin to recognize the hidden suffering in others, a new challenge arises. What do we do with our own reactions? Because let's be honest, no matter how wise our insights, when someone insults us, lies to us, or acts with cruelty, the sting is real. Anger flares. Defensiveness tightens our chest. The mind races with comebacks we'll probably never say aloud. This is where the Buddhist practices of mindfulness and equanimity become not just concepts, but lifelines. Mindfulness, or sati, is more than simple awareness. It's the deliberate moment-to-moment attention to our thoughts, emotions, and bodily sensations without judgment. It's like switching on a light in a dark room. Suddenly, you can see what's really happening inside. The tension in your shoulders, the anger rising in your chest, the stories your mind begins to tell. They're so selfish. They always do this. I don't deserve this. Instead of being swept away by these reactions, mindfulness invites us to notice them, to name them. Anger is here. Hurt is here. The desire to retaliate is here. And in that noticing, we create a space, a crucial, tender pause where choice becomes possible. The Buddha described this beautifully. In the seeing, let there be only the seeing. In the hearing, let there be only the hearing. In other words, we don't have to fuse ourselves with every emotion that arises. Feelings come and go, like clouds passing through the sky of the mind. The practice is to witness them without clinging, without suppressing, and without acting from them impulsively. But mindfulness alone isn't enough, because sometimes, even when we see our anger, it burns hot. That's where equanimity, upekkha, comes in. Equanimity is the quiet strength that allows us to stay steady in the face of life's inevitable ups and downs. It's not indifference. It's not cold detachment. It's the deep understanding that all things, including difficult people and painful moments, are impermanent, that nothing stays the same, and that our peace doesn't have to depend on anyone else's behavior. The ancient teachers likened equanimity to a tree in a storm. The wind may shake the leaves, bend the branches, but the roots remain grounded. In the same way, when someone's anger or cruelty sweeps through your life, equanimity keeps you from being uprooted. It reminds you, this too will pass. And more than that, it offers the profound realization that you don't have to take another person's suffering personally. Because when someone lashes out, it often has very little to do with you, and everything to do with the storms they're weathering inside. Mindfulness helps you see what's arising in the present moment. Equanimity helps you hold it all with steadiness and grace. Together, they create the conditions for genuine compassion. Because when you're not lost in reactivity, you have the clarity and space to choose a different response, to speak with kindness, to set boundaries without hatred, to forgive, not because you condone, but because you refuse to chain your heart to another's suffering. In those moments, you become free. And perhaps most importantly, you become a refuge for yourself and for others. A quiet presence that no storm can shake. And in a world so often ruled by reaction, that presence is a rare and healing gift. As we continue this journey, we'll explore how to express compassion in ways that are both wise and courageous. Because compassion isn't passive. It doesn't mean saying yes to harm or pretending everything is okay. True compassion sometimes means speaking hard truths or walking away. And understanding when to act and when to simply hold space, that is the art we'll begin to explore next. But for now, remember this. Your mindfulness is the lamp. Your equanimity is the ground beneath your feet. And with these, you can meet even the most difficult people with a heart that is both tender and unshakable. It's a beautiful idea, isn't it? To stay mindful, to be steady like a tree in a storm. But let's be honest, life has a way of testing even the calmest hearts. There will be moments when you'll feel it, that raw, unfiltered surge of anger, jealousy, resentment. A burning in your chest, a tightness in your jaw, an urge to shout, to defend, to cut someone out of your life for good. And in those moments, compassion can feel impossibly far away. But here's the truth. Those emotions aren't mistakes. They aren't proof of failure. In Buddhist thought, they are messengers, teachers in disguise. You see, in the Dhammapada, the Buddha once said, "By oneself is evil done, by oneself is one defiled. By oneself is evil left undone. By oneself is one made pure." In other words, it's what you do with these emotions that matters, not whether they arise, because they inevitably will. The practice isn't to avoid them, but to transform them. So, how do we do that? First, you name it. When anger appears, say gently to yourself, "Ah, anger is here." When jealousy arises, note it, jealousy is here. The simple act of naming breaks the spell. It reminds you that you are not the emotion. You're the awareness holding it, and that awareness is your power. Next, investigate. Ask yourself, what is this emotion trying to protect? What wound is it covering? More often than not, you'll find that beneath anger lies hurt. Beneath jealousy, fear. Beneath resentment, a sense of being unseen or unvalued. When you begin to see this, your heart naturally softens. Not because you're excusing harmful behavior, but because you're reconnecting with your own humanity. You realize, this is what it feels like to be human. This is suffering. And from that place of honesty, compassion can be born. Then choose an intentional response. Maybe it means taking a breath before you speak. Maybe it's walking away for a moment, not in avoidance, but to gather yourself. Maybe it's writing down what you wish you could say, just so the words don't poison your heart. And when you're ready, you respond, not from the heat of emotion, but from the clarity of presence. Sometimes it'll be a kind word. Sometimes a boundary. Sometimes a silence deeper than any reply. That's practical compassion, not abstract, not sentimental, but rooted in the messy, unpredictable, beautiful reality of everyday life. And here's the part many people forget. This practice begins with yourself. Because let's face it, the hardest person to be compassionate toward is often the one looking back in the mirror. When you lash out, when you fall short, when you let anger or envy or spite take hold, the voice inside can be merciless. But remember, you're human too. You bleed, you ache, you struggle. The Buddha taught that until you've made peace with your own suffering, you'll struggle to hold space for the suffering of others. So when you falter, and you will, meet yourself with the same tenderness you long to offer the world. I see you. I see your pain. I see how hard you're trying. This isn't weakness. It's the birthplace of strength. Because when you begin to make a habit of meeting your emotions with awareness, kindness, and steady discipline, something shifts. The same anger that once made you sharp and bitter becomes the fuel for setting healthy boundaries. The jealousy that gnawed at you becomes a guide, pointing toward unhealed parts of your heart. The resentment you carried becomes a reminder of what you value and what you will no longer allow. In this way, compassion stops being a distant ideal and becomes a daily, living practice. It turns your heart into a field where even the thorns of emotion can bloom into wisdom. And the beautiful, unexpected thing is, the people around you begin to feel it too. Not because you've preached to them, not because you've lectured them about mindfulness or Buddhism or compassion, but because your presence has changed. You've become less reactive, more steady, more quietly kind. And in a world where most people are just trying to survive their own storms, that presence is medicine. In the next part of our journey, we'll explore how to carry this practice into real relationships, how to express compassion not just in your thoughts but in your actions, even with the people who challenge you most. Because compassion isn't passive. It's not about being a doormat or pretending nothing hurts. It's about choosing again and again to be both kind and strong, both open-hearted and wise. And that, my friend, is a rare and beautiful art. Compassion, for all its beauty, can be dangerous if it lacks wisdom. Without discernment, it can turn into enabling. Without clear boundaries, it can drain your spirit dry. And without wisdom, it can tether you to people and situations that stunt your growth under the illusion of kindness. This is one of the most misunderstood aspects of compassion, and one the Buddha spoke of often. You see, real compassion isn't about fixing people. It's not about sacrificing yourself at the altar of someone else's dysfunction. And it's definitely not about pretending that harm isn't harm. True compassion is skillful. It knows when to lean in and when to step away. It recognizes that while every being is worthy of kindness, not every behavior should be tolerated. And that sometimes, the most compassionate thing you can do is say no. Let's be clear about something. Boundaries are not walls. A wall shuts people out. A boundary honors your capacity, your safety, your peace. It says, I see your suffering, but I will not let it spill into my life unchecked. I wish you healing, but I refuse to drown alongside you. The Buddha taught about upya, skillful means. It's the art of knowing how to respond to each situation with wisdom, compassion, and appropriateness. Sometimes that means offering a hand. Other times it means offering silence. And occasionally it means walking away. There's a famous story in Buddhist tradition about a monk who was asked to tend to a fellow monk, one who was gravely ill but also cruel and bitter. The compassionate monk cared for him day and night. But when the sick monk refused to treat others with respect, continuing to harm those around him, the Buddha intervened. He taught that compassion must be paired with wisdom, that no one should be a vessel for another's unexamined cruelty. Compassion, yes. Endurance, no. Because without wisdom, compassion can turn into martyrdom. So how do we cultivate this skillful compassion in our own lives? How do we know when to stay and when to leave? When to forgive and when to protect ourselves? It starts with clarity. Before responding to a difficult person, pause. Ask yourself, is my action rooted in genuine care, or is it coming from guilt, fear, or a need to be liked? Is what I'm offering sustainable for me, or is it depleting my peace? Will this act of compassion help this person grow, or will it enable them to stay stuck? That pause, that honest moment with yourself, is the difference between blind kindness and awakened compassion. Next, communicate your boundaries with grace. You don't need to be cruel. You don't need to justify your peace. A simple, steady statement is enough. I care about you, and I also need to honor what's healthy for me. I understand you're struggling, but it's not okay to speak to me that way. I hope you find healing, but I can no longer be part of this dynamic. Your boundary is your compassion for yourself in action. And in many cases, it's also the most honest form of compassion you can offer to someone else. Because pretending everything is fine when it isn't keeps people asleep. It shields them from the natural consequences of their actions. And while the Dharma teaches us to be kind, it also teaches us to let people experience their own karma. And lastly, release the outcome. Not everyone will understand your boundaries. Some will accuse you of being cold, unkind, or selfish. Let them. Their discomfort isn't your burden to carry. As long as your heart is steady, your intention is pure, and your actions are skillful, you are practicing the highest form of compassion. A compassion that honors both yourself and others. A compassion that isn't afraid to say enough. Because love without wisdom is chaos, and wisdom without love is barren. But together, they are a force powerful enough to heal not only relationships but entire lives. And here's the most remarkable part. When you live this way, you become an unshakable refuge. The people around you, even those who once tested your limits, will sense it. Some will drift away, some will transform, and some will simply stop expecting you to carry what was never yours to hold. That is the quiet, fierce beauty of skillful compassion. As we come to the final stretch of this journey together, let's reflect on where we've come. From understanding the paradox of compassion, to recognizing suffering, to embracing mindfulness, transforming emotions, and now learning to set wise boundaries. Each step has led us closer to a heart that can remain open without losing itself. And now, in our final chapter, we'll weave it all together. A closing reflection on how to carry this practice forward into a noisy, restless world. A world that desperately needs people brave enough to love with wisdom and stand firm with kindness. Stay with me, because the final chapter is where everything truly begins. Some lessons aren't meant to be learned in books. Some truths aren't discovered in the stillness of a meditation hall. They rise from the grit of everyday life, in the tension of difficult conversations, the sting of betrayal, the quiet ache of disappointment. And yet, these are the exact places where compassion is forged, not as a soft, sentimental feeling, but as a fierce, steady force. A light you carry into the dark, a wisdom that keeps your heart open while your eyes stay clear. Over these chapters, we've journeyed through the paradox of loving those who test our peace. We've explored the Buddhist roots of compassion, the nature of suffering behind every difficult person, and the steadying practices of mindfulness and equanimity. We've learned how to transmute our own negative emotions and how to draw healthy, compassionate boundaries without abandoning love. And now, as we close this path together, one truth remains. Compassion is not passive, it's not a duty, and it's certainly not weakness. It's an act of rebellion. In a world addicted to reactivity, blame, and division, to choose compassion is to choose courage. Because when you stop meeting hatred with hatred, when you refuse to mirror bitterness and instead offer steady presence, you change the chemistry of every room you enter. You become the one who breaks cycles, the one who quietly heals unseen wounds, the one whose calm becomes contagious. This is how compassion transforms not just relationships but the world itself. It begins with you. In the way you speak to the person who hurt you, in the pause you take before reacting to provocation, in the invisible prayers you send to those lost in their own darkness, and perhaps most importantly, in the fierce kindness you extend to yourself. Because the heart you heal first is your own. And here's the beautiful irony. When you stop trying to fix difficult people, when you release the need to control or be understood, something remarkable happens. You become free. Free to love without attachment. Free to care without losing your peace. Free to be a sanctuary in a world still learning how to be gentle. And that, my friend, is the highest form of compassion. As we wrap this journey, I invite you to carry these teachings into your everyday moments, not as abstract ideas, but as living practices. Notice the next time frustration rises in your chest. Observe the story your mind spins about someone's behavior, and ask yourself, what would compassion do here? Not the easy, sentimental kind, but the kind that honors both love and wisdom. And when you stumble, because you will remember. This is a lifelong path, a practice measured not in perfection but in presence, If this journey spoke to something in you, if you found wisdom, comfort, or courage along the way, I'd be honored if you'd help share it. Hit that like button. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. We're building a space here for hearts like yours. And drop a comment below. What moment in this series touched you the most? Which chapter stayed with you long after it ended? Your stories fuel this space. Your voice matters here. And until we meet again on the next teaching, may your heart stay open, your mind remain clear, and your compassion fierce, boundless, and wise. Thank you for walking this path with me.